Welcome to the Tree Fund webinar series. My name is Bo Broadbeck. It's always a pleasure to be here and serve as host and moderator of the Tree Fund webinar series. We have a great topic today. We have not just one presenter, we have three presenters with diverse and deep experience in the field of arboriculture. We have one of our trustees with Tree Fund with us today, so we've got a lot of good information coming y'all's way. First, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Heath Hupke, to give us a little bit of a Tree Fund update.
Well, thank you everybody again for coming today. And as you make your way in, please again in our chat function, please let us know where you're from, where you're attending and watching us today. We are a Tree Fund. We are happy and always excited to be able to host our webinar series, bringing CEUs and more so relevant and new research that we were able to fund and make possible today. And part of our goal is always getting this information out to you, the people into your hands, and for you to also be able to ask questions. And as you're able to, we do have a question and answer function in this chat. So be sure to find that along the way as our speakers are presenting. We want to make sure we do thank our sponsors. As a nonprofit, as a non-government entity, we rely upon donations, individuals, and our corporate partners. So on your screen here, you can see those that have stepped up above and beyond and really helped lead Tree Fund and the ability to one, make these webinars free for all of us. So thank you to our sponsors. And if you are looking to be involved, if you find our webinar series helpful, if you find today's information helpful, you want to support Tree Fund and our mission and making sure that we are always bringing relevant and upcoming and needing research, please feel free to open up this link to look at treefund.org and consider a donation, whether it be $5 or $500. All of it really is appreciated and supporting the work that we do every single day. If many of you know that these are all free and the CEUs that are being captured. So if you signed up and registered, all of your information we already have. You do not need to send that to us. We've got it all. We know when you're hopping on and when you're hopping off. So make sure that you do stay for the entirety of today's presentation. If you are needing a certificate of attendance, you will still need to stay on the whole time, but you can send an email to education@treefund.org and we can get you that certificate as soon as we're able to. Now, do realize we have almost 1,200 people right now on here. So for ISA to get all of these CUs processed, for me to be able to get back to you, it will take some time. But do know that we will send out an email when those get processed. And so if you're seeing anything missing at that time, let us know. We have a couple webinars already scheduled, a couple others that are kind of in the behind the scenes that we're still working on. But July 21st with Thomas Whitney, the FC of Affidelities, and will be coming here. And then on the 25th with Lawrence Kahn, mandatory minimum clearance requirements. So a couple that you can look forward to, register here, and we'll see you in a couple months. It's possible we'll have one in June, and then we do look to fill out the rest of the schedule September through December. So always be sure to check treefund.org for upcoming webinars as they pop up. Next,
one last little housekeeping item just for everybody. With a lot of y'all here, just please, if you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. The chat's a good place for y'all to kind of communicate amongst yourselves, make comments. But if you have a question that you would like myself or one of the presenters to look at, please put that into Q&A function. Thanks. Okay, Heath, back to you.
Thank you, Bo. Next, I'm honored and privileged to be able to introduce Megan Fielding. Megan is with Asplin. She leads the corporate sustainability, including the environmental, social, and governance governance initiatives and works closely with external partners to deepen Asplund's commitment to the local communities. She has decades of expertise in financial services and responsible investing as she collaborates with teams across the organization. Um, Megan holds her MA in International Studies from the University of San Francisco and a BA in Economics from Wheaton College, along with a certificate in Sustainability Leadership from Harvard, T.H. Chan School of Public Health. But for Tree Fund, she has also been a great leader on our board of trustees behind the scenes. Oh, and so thank you, Megan, for helping introduce today and for your continued hard work and always saying yes to help Tree Fund and the future of research. So thank you, Megan.
Well, thank you. And thank you for everyone. At one point, what do we have? Over 1,200 people participating today and counting. And thank you to the Tree Fund for supporting both researchers and the arboriculture profession. My name is Megan Fielding. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability with Asplund Tree Expert. And as Heath said, I serve as a Board of Trustee volunteer with the Tree Fund. At Asplund, we are very proud to support the Tree Fund and to recognize the meaningful impact they have on your work and on our industry as a whole. Last year, many of you might have heard, we announced one of the ways we are strengthening that commitment, and that is by reestablishing the Hyland's R. Johns Grant Program, which funds long-term research projects that benefit arborists in their everyday work. Hyland R. Johns was a remarkable leader in arboriculture and a founder of the ISA Research Trust, which later became the Tree Fund. It's no surprise that the grant bearing his name has generated valuable insights for our field. Research such as Dr. Ed Gilman's effects of root pruning newly planted and large trees on decay, root generation, and stability, and John Goodfellow's development of risk assessment criteria for branch failures within the crowns of trees, among many others, including the work presented by our speakers today. With that legacy in mind, Asplund has committed to fully fund this endowment with an investment of over $500,000, allowing the grant program to become active again beginning this fall or September, October timeframe this year as the Asplund Hyland R. Johns Research Grant Program as part of Asplund's centennial celebration. Today, I am honored to introduce our speakers, Richard Hauer, Andrew Koeser, and Jake Miesbauer. Richard is the Director of Urban Forestry at Eocene Environmental Group and Emeritus Professor of Urban Forestry at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Andrew is an Associate Professor of Urban Tree and Landscape Management at the University of Florida, Gulf Coast Research and Education Center in the Tampa Bay, Florida area. And Jake is the Arboriculture Research Scientist at the Morton Arboretum Center for Tree Science in Illinois, leading its arboriculture research group. All three of our speakers are actively engaged in arboriculture and urban forestry research. With that introduction, please join me in welcoming our speakers to today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Megan. So I'm going to share a screen here. And all right. Hey, it's our pleasure to present here today on myself, Jake, and Andrew. I'm going to start the webinar off by giving a background on tree injection and kind of the implications of ash tree populations and whether it makes sense to actually do long-term treatments. Jake's going to come in and he's going to talk about the methodologies behind the research project that we're so grateful that the Tree Fund funded. And then Andrew's going to kick it off the end with presenting the results that we found from this research effort. So first and foremost, when you think about tree injection, there's a lot of systems out there. And this is just a potpourri of different technologies out there. There's even some technologies that aren't on this slide that are more advanced and more recent. But interesting enough, if you go back in time, that there's actually evidence in the 12th century where injection of materials into a plant, in this case, actually try to infuse color and smells into flowers. And I suppose you're kind of wondering, why would someone do that academically? I guess just for the curiosity of it, to try to get a better smell into a flower. And I guess that'd be really good for Bradford pear trees in the springtime. But you could go into the 15th century when actually a woody plant, there's evidence. And can't say that no one before Leonardo da Vinci actually did inject things into the trees. But here's a case where da Vinci did, and it was actually injecting arsenic into apple trees. And the idea behind this was to prevent theft. Now, there's nothing on a label about arsenic for injecting it for theft prevention. So just saying don't do that. But it's kind of interesting. It was a crude system. So a slit was put into a tree, actually an auger hole, and then arsenic was put into it with the idea that if you put arsenic into a tree, you're going to prevent theft of apples. Now, Da Vinci also, interesting enough, had he was an amazing artist, as we know, but he was also a pretty amazing scientist. And if you look at like the cross-sectional areas of trees, there's Da Vinci came up with this idea that the mathematically, if you look at the cross-section of a parent stem and those parts that branch off of that, you've got a similar cross-sectional area. There's actually some more recent science that went to say was Da Vinci correct, and for the most part, yeah, he kind of nailed it there. There's some anomalies if you get like a wound wood that you may get a larger cross-sectional area that's induced by wounding, but overall, Da Vinci had a really cool take on biomechanics, many centuries ago. Now, a case of actually using injection as a technique for preventing insect, herbivory on plants, using actually mercury. Now, again, I would not put mercury into plants. We know certainly mercury and different variations of it are not good for environmental things. But in the case here of a book on new improvements of planting and gardening, that Richard Bradley actually did inject with a slit into a tree mercury, with the idea that the insects themselves are going to be destroyed. And there's some evidence actually that did happen. Now, it was into the 19th and the 20th century. And now I feel really old because I was a participant living in the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st. But if you look at some of the different techniques, it was really applications of things sitting around. So for example, you got a funnel up here. The idea is you put a hole in the tree, you put your chemical, and gravitational or transpirational pull will bring the material. A grease gun, so here's actually where you could use pressure, or any sorts of apparatus where you're either using transpirational stream or some sort of physics such as gravitational pressure of getting materials into a tree. And so, yeah, there's a huge history of different techniques. It was in the late 1930s when a researcher, William Roach, came up with really the first take on all the techniques and technologies that were out there. Very few on woody plants, of modern take of things that we think about today for plant healthcare. But again, the first take where some did literature review to say, what do we actually know about the science behind injection, the biology behind it, does it work, different chemistries, and thinking about what are some of the negative implications. Now, there's no injection studies I could find right about that time of Roach's work, but we could take a look at maybe increment cores and looking at an increment core and the impacts of discoloration and wounding in a tree. So yeah, it's a much bigger wound than, let's say, some of the drills that we use, drill bits that we use today, but certainly gives you an idea. And some of the early compartmentalization studies prior to Shigo that Shigo would often give credit to, of differences of like paper birch and basswood are poor compartmentalizers. Something like sugar maple and yellow birch, much better. And then thinking about, if you wound a tree, can you put something into it? And some of the early studies said no. Actually, if you plug a tree with a wood dowel, it has no lasting or positive aspects. Actually, there could be some disadvantages. The science of the day, or the application, I should say, was put a wood dowel into the wound and hammer it. And the idea was you get the wood plug into the tree. The problem is when you're hammering it and you're hammering in the cambial tissue, you actually cause more damage. So actually one of the implications was putting something into the tree. In this case, wood plug had no benefit. And if you do a poor application, you get more damage. And there's even more studies than just that one. One of the more recent ones is where they looked at control trees versus some different sealant coverings, such as lock balsam or polyurethane. And creosote encased wooden dowels, the idea that creosote is really good against microbial compounds. The problem is for some of the species that actually had a negative chemical toxicity where you had actually greater cambial dieback. So the lesson from all these studies is if you have an open wound, putting something into it, we have no magic elixir. And then we could look at, do wounding trees cause damage, where you could look at it from a mortality perspective. And again, getting back at increment cores, a study from 2019 found with, a huge data set that there was no difference between cored trees and uncored trees in survivability. So the take here is if anytime you do any treatment to a tree, are we causing more harm than good? And the answer is with a lot of the past research is the science would say it depends on the species from discoloration, but from a mortality perspective, no differences. Now, it was in the 1960s when J.J. Mange company, for example, came out with a technique and approach to put chemicals into a tree, in this case, actually bidrin, which is an insecticide. And the idea here is, for example, in the city of Milwaukee, is treating for Dutch elm disease rather than using spraying for insects. What if we put something into the tree that could kill the elm bark beetles? And actually was effective at killing insects. The problem is it wasn't as effective to kill huge populations. And the problem is, how does Dutch elm disease spread? Yeah, from insect via fungus. So it's really the treatment was wrong. It should have been at the fungus level. So and here's just, I just love this picture of all these elm trees in the city of Milwaukee, amazing forestry program. Unfortunately, they didn't have the science behind them for Dutch elm disease management, and treating at the insect level just didn't work. And so here's a case of 1956 actually going to 1969 of just the loss of elm trees, if you're kind of curious from that perspective. It was in the 1970s when Dr. Heimlich from the University of Illinois actually started looking at different techniques. And he wasn't the first one to look at treatment of fungicides and getting into a tree. And the idea here was, do you need to use pressure or not? And interesting enough, Heimlich used pressure up to 400 psi and found no cambial damage in the tree. Well, what they did was actually they injected into the sapwood area. And so they used a lag screw, they drilled into it, they welded on a steel pipe, and then they put the pressurized apparatus, getting fungicide into the tree. And 400 psi is huge, but they weren't at the cambial region, they're actually in the sapwood, probably explaining maybe those high levels of pressure having no evidence of damaging the tree. Now, there is evidence actually of using different PSIs in the 200 to 600 range. That, yeah, if you're actually at the cambial region with some of the technologies we use these days, yes, you can get bark cracking, bark damage, which certainly isn't a desirable outcome. So the more modern techniques we use, for example, with emerald ash borer treatment, much lower PSIs. And so maybe in the 30, 40 range, if you're using let's say a bicycle pump to get pressurization, or some of the other approaches out there where there's for example, maybe CO2 or some other apparatus of getting pressures, again, under 100 psi. And so these techniques, there is always concern, do you have too much pressure? And so as a practitioner, regardless of what systems you use, you should always do observations later on. And that theme will come up here in a little bit. Now, I have to give a credit to one of my early career mentors, Mark Stennis. Perhaps some of you on this call actually know Mark. If many of you do not, I wish you would have. Mark, though, came up with the idea of actually treatment for Dutch elm disease. And rather than going in the trunk region, Mark's idea was in this transition zone between the root system and the trunk. And it actually became very effective. And I'll talk a little bit about this later on. The idea with sanitation is the most important. So whether you use chemical or similar methodology, if you think about our modern plant health care approaches, certainly it's a multitude of approaches. First, identify diseased trees, get rid of them, but you can also protect elm trees with fungicides. And I imagine there's many of you on this call that actually have had some experience either as a practitioner or perhaps an observer of trees that have been treated for insect or disease control. Now, 2015, Tom Smiley and Sean Burnett came out with a really much needed current beyond what Roche had for the science of the day. This is our science of the day, our best management practices. In 2015, they came out with this ISA BMP on tree injection, much needed. Most recent update is 2022. And there's some interesting things in here. I shouldn't say interesting, some really good state of the art. Trees that compartmentalize wounds better, or I should say in this transition zone, you get better compartmentalization. That's one of the recommendations. You get greater uptake of whatever material you're putting into the tree. You get greater lateral movement, and up at the canopy itself, you can get greater crown distribution. Now, this can vary by species, but overall, this is if you can treat in this area with an injection, that's preferred. Okay. The other thing is the drilling. How far you go into the tree? Now, I'd have to say a few years ago, I was starting a study on our campus at UWSP, University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and I hadn't injected a tree in a while. So I actually had a former student. She was working for Rainbow Ecoscience at the time, to have her actually train me. So I was her professor in the spring. This summer, she had graduated and was working for that company, and she trained me. And it's one of those aha moments where she's like showing me how to drill into a tree, and all of a sudden the evidence was when you start seeing some wood shavings come out like these little pigtails, you've gone far enough. And it's like the old duh moment came upon me. It's like, but having someone actually show you a technique is really important before you do it. So go no further than you need to. Just be on the phloem into the sapwood area. 1 or 2 growth rings in is really what you need. And don't have the drill bit so it's actually perpendicular to the stem itself. Don't rock or spin, so let the drill bit do the work. A sharp drill bit's important, and don't be a cheapo. Drill bits get dull, and you want to have a clean cut. Not to cauterize the wound per se, because that can have an impact on uptake. And replace the bit maybe every 5 to 10 trees. Obviously, it depends on the size. And so maybe if you think about this, maybe this is every 25 to 50 injection holes, or 50 to 75, somewhere in that ballpark. Now, the last thing on BMPs here is if you think about injection, smaller is better, less frequently. So, for example, using emamectin benzoate, there is a label recommendation every 2 years. There's also some science, and I'll show you actually one slide that you can be on a 3-year cycle. The caveat on that, though, is if you're doing a 3-year cycle, you want to actually do that 3rd-year cycle actually in the springtime. So if you injected in October of 2020, don't come back in 2023, you would not want to have injected in October. You would have wanted to have done it in the spring time frame. And again, don't put dolls in trees. All right, so ash trees, how good is our approaches? Well, think about it from an economic perspective. This was also a tree fund funded project that I was happy to work with a couple undergraduate students that we actually did a really good job of finding out that the economics behind emerald ash borer actually makes sense. So when we got into this study, the first thing, the idea was if you look at the cost of management and you look at this slide, what's your best option if you just look at the cost of anything? Well, yeah, preemptive removal. Get rid of all your trees and don't replant them. Why? Because trees cost money. And you could say that same thing for universities, hospitals, et cetera, roads, they all cost money. But no, why do we have things like trees, roads, hospitals, webinars like this? Why? Because they add value. So actually, that was the novel thing we brought into emerald ash borer management. So if you look at the economics, net present value is where you account for inflationary value of money, and you account for treatments over time. And so when you have a positive net present value, that's a good thing. These are benefit cost ratios, these little red numbers here with the dot. And so, long story here, making it short, is not having an emerald ash borer is your best option. That doesn't probably surprise you, but then actually treatment. The treatment costs at the time we did the study were $10 a dime or inch. And so actually if you're doing municipal stuff, you can do this for probably 25% of that cost today. So it's even more advantageous. It's big, healthy ash trees make sense. Now, if you have a big unhealthy ash tree, it probably doesn't make sense to treat. And in this case, actually, green ash trees, when they get about 100 years of age, brown rot can actually be an issue. One of my colleague friends from Oregon just sent me a picture this morning on some trees in that state, curious if the emamectin benzoate treatments they're doing cause this. And the images I saw actually were just classic brown rot. So my friend from Oregon, I'll get back to you later today. Small trees in crummy locations probably don't make sense to treat either. So I'd put my money into replanting. Now, the thing is, of all the research I've been involved with, whether it's emerald ash borer or others, there's a lot of answers and a lot of solutions to the questions you have. And so we're going to be presenting that. So, one idea of emerald ash borer, and this kind of ties into our long-term study here that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, is if you look at these 2 healthy ash trees here, they're awesome. They're both actually green ash trees, just excellent condition, look really healthy. The idea, though, is could you actually replant? And the idea is maybe 20 years down the road, maybe you give up on treatment of trees for whatever reason. It just doesn't make sense from a treatment or a management perspective. But in the meantime, you have canopy. So the idea, could you have no net loss for a period of time? And so actually the study I got going on, really treatments work. And so if you don't treat trees, they're going to get less healthy. A tree that's 0% is dead, 100%, you see nothing wrong with the tree. Whether you use a bark spray with dinotefuran, another common trade name is Safari, imidacloprid, another common trade name is Merit, or actually use an emamectin benzoate on a 2 or 3-year cycle, chemistries work. And this is not novel, by the way. But actually, one part that was novel until my friend Cliff Sadoff from Purdue actually beat us to the punch of actually publishing that a 3-year cycle statistically is no different than a 2-year cycle for effects on emerald ash borer treatment. Again, the caveat in year 3, you don't want to do it in the fall of the year, you want to do it in the spring. And then the other aspect of actually long-term studies, you could think of the non-treatment of trees. Yes, they die at a higher rate. We also have trees die in the urban forest from other reasons. So part of this long-term study I have going on, it's in year 10, it's a 20-year study, is we have ash trees die for other reasons. Partially windstorms. We have none of our treatment trees that have died yet from emerald ash borer. I'm expecting one or two this year are going to die that were treated with dinotephrine. And I think one of the reasons we underdosed them, but regardless, plus they're getting larger in size. But most of the trees that have died on our campus have actually been administrative decisions when you build a building and the trees just didn't make sense for long-term preservation. All right, a few other injection-related research topics, and I'll turn it over to Jake. As we could look at a study I was involved with Dr. Ball and Eric North, and Fred Miller is also a participant on this work, and looked at open versus sealed systems, and is there any external wounding that you could see differences? And just briefly, you can get external wounding from treatments. And so whatever you do, whether it's emerald ash borer or some other plant health technique that you're using, make observations. Again, is the technique itself maybe causing more damage? And one thing we found is actually with the sealed system, yeah, if you just look at mean wound area, there's some evidence of about a 4 times greater external wounding area than the sealed system. Okay. But here's the interesting caveat. I'm glad we added this component to the study. Could we see any evidence of external wounding and explain it for maybe the application was done appropriately considering like a manufacturer's recommendation? And that actually explained a huge part of improper treatment. So something, for example, a closed system, putting a plug into a tree, the recommendation is what? You want to have that thing right at the campal region. So the trees that had external wounding, the plug itself in the closed system was not inset correctly. So if you're going to use this system, key thing is follow the manufacturer's recommendations, which this image is from the tree injection BMP from 2022. And a few last things before I turn over to Jake. As we said, smaller wounds are always better. Here's a study from 2016 that showed smaller wounds close sooner than larger wounds. That probably doesn't surprise you. And the other thing is open system did close slightly greater than a closed system. And the key thing here is the longer a system is open, the more oxygen that actually gets into the tree that can, and other things that could affect discoloration and also fungal degradation of tissue. And then one of the initial early studies done by Deb McCullough and her student, where they actually found in a short-term study that ash trees that actually were treated correctly with a closed system in this case, where you follow manufacturer's recommendations, you don't get much discoloration. And when I look at the scale of this, think of like your pinky and your thumb on average. That's really every time you put a wound in a green ash tree, that's what you could expect from a short-term perspective. So I'm going to turn over to Jake, and we're going to look at, fine, if you inject 1 or 2 cycles, what do you get when you inject 4 to 6 cycles? Do you get the same effects that Deb found? So off to you, Jake.
All right, thank you, Rich. Yeah, so working with the city of Milwaukee, we wanted to investigate. The city of Milwaukee has been treating their trees at the time that we conducted this study, 4 to 6 rounds of treatment. So at a 2-year, every other year treatment cycle at the time, they had been treated for 8 to 12 years. So we wanted to investigate if there were how the trees responded to long-term repeated injections. So next. Rich, next, thank you. So in July of 21, Rich and I selected 60 trees from the street tree population in the city of Milwaukee. We made sure that they were geographically distributed throughout the city so that we had equal representation throughout various times that the trees were planted and in development and to standardize that way. The diameter range we selected 36 to 55 centimeters, roughly about 14 to 22-inch diameter, so that we could make sure that the trees were big enough to have enough rounds of injections, but also not too big as to be physically unwieldy and put a top end on it that way. And then prior to harvesting, we physically went out and evaluated the overall tree condition and canopy thinning the crowns. Next slide. All right, so on the left, you can see an example of a tree that had a pretty thin crown, a lot, fair amount of dieback out at the tips, and you know, pretty well into the canopy. Whereas on the right, we had a nice, full, healthy canopy with no observable dieback. Next slide. All right, so made those selections. A couple other things that we also recorded at the base of the tree where the previous injections had been done, we recorded the number of cambial separations or injection injury areas. We call them cambial blowouts, if you will, where they were improperly injected, causing the cambium around the injection site to separate. Next slide. And we also measured the width of the planting strip. So we wanted to look at how perhaps amount of rooting area or that the amount of space that the trees were planted into possibly could have affected this as well. Next slide. So we selected those 60 trees. The following spring, the trees were harvested, and the lower roughly 1.5 meters, so about a 5-foot section of the trunk, the trees were cut as flush to the ground, as close to the ground as possible, without going so far as to damage the chainsaw and or cause any other issues. So we got the lowest possible 5-foot section of the trunk, and then they were brought here to the Morton Arboretum in suburban Chicago for destructive analysis. From those 60 trunk sections, we selected 40 of them that we destructively we dissected for analysis. So next slide. And here's the team that did the work on the dissection, Rich and myself, along with Abby and Matthew and Aaron back there. So thank you to all of those folks for their hard work on this project. We wouldn't be able to get this work done without the folks who helped us on this project. Next slide. And go Packers. Yeah, so here you can see we dissected them in 15-centimeter thick sections, so 6-inch thick cookies, if you will, or cross sections. So we had 7 segments stacked up. On the right here, you can see a pile of them on the left. Next slide. So here's about half of them. You can see the sections here. That's Matthew, one of our students, and he was a lot of help, and he's a lot of fun to work with. So continue. So one issue that we noticed immediately is that it is with just a raw chainsaw cut, it was very difficult to differentiate the discoloration and different types of discoloration in the xylem of the cross section. So next slide. We had to process the samples prior to doing the imaging that we needed to do to assess discoloration. Next slide. So the first step was to plane a flat surface so that when we did the imaging that there wouldn't be any part of the surface closer to or further away from the camera. So we planed everything down to make it smooth and flat. And then next slide. We sanded to 240 grade, smoothness. Next. And that processing level made it easy to distinguish differences in discoloration. So the left arrow, you can see discoloration that is specific to the injected material. And then the right arrow is pointing to some discoloration radiating out from the center of the tree. So we call this, it's kind of like a spoke on a bicycle wheel. We call these spokes injection-induced discoloration. And once we got to this stage, we were able to do the imaging and able to differentiate more clearly what we were looking at. So next slide. So this is our setup where we set the camera at a set distance away from the cross section. You can see on the cross section, there's a ruler that we placed in the center for scale. And and we took pictures of each of the 7 cross sections per every each of the 40 trunks. So 7 times 40, there's 280 cross section images. So we took the pictures and downloaded them so that we could use ImageJ software for analysis. Next. So in ImageJ, we were able to trace the outline of all of the discolored area. We asked it to delineate it, but then we had to do a lot of manual post-processing to make sure that we got exactly the outline that we were looking for. I had an intern student named Ian working on this, and he did a really good job working with the software. So this is a slide where this image, we differentiated all of the discoloration, both the internal central discoloration, the injection-induced discoloration, these spokes radiating away, as well as the actual discoloration from the injection material itself. Next slide. We also differentiated out only the injection-induced discoloration, leaving out the central core of discoloration that the trees have. And then we've also differentiated out, next slide, just discoloration due to the injections themselves. I did see a question about the plugs and leaving the plugs in and kind of how maybe it related to like putting dowels in. When the plugs were put in properly, we really didn't notice anything detrimental at all. So the trees sealed over the injuries with the plugs fine when they were injected, put in properly. So just to answer that question without, yeah, go ahead. Next slide. And then from these, we calculated the percent of the area highlighted here in each of the 3 different total discoloration, injection-induced discoloration, and injection discoloration, and then calculated that as a percentage of the total cross-sectional area. So putting the ruler on the tree allowed us to have a scale that the software then calculated what was inside and outside of the yellow line that we traced. Okay, next slide. Sorry. And here's a picture. So we looked at cambial separation, both externally, so these cambial blowouts, and on the right, this is what it looks like in cross-section. So you can see it was injected, the cambium on either side of the injection separated out, and then subsequent, you can see, you know, the wound wood or the ram's horning sealing over that wound. So we looked at how much of the area was both internal and external discoloration that we considered as part of our analysis. Next slide. And so I'll turn it over to Andrew to talk about the analysis and the implications of what we found. Andrew?
Great. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, Rich. So as we mentioned before, we had 3 types of discoloration we were looking at. The total percentage, and we use percentage as a scalar because as you have a bigger diameter tree, you'll have more injection sites, and you'll have more discoloration. So, you know, using a percentage is a great equalizer in that regard. So we had total discoloration as a percent. We had the spokes or the injection induced discoloration, and then we had the actual injection discoloration that was where the drilling sites occurred. And we were wondering if there's, you know, visual cues that arborists could look at to get a sense of what was going on internally within the tree. So, you know, we showed you what we measured in the field. That included canopy thinning, you know, what part of the canopy is dying back, and you have twig dieback visible. Planting strip width, the number of cambial separation injuries. So like Jake showed you that cambial separation. Sometimes it's visible and sometimes it's completely you know, closed over. So this number reflects everything, the stuff that was visible externally, and then also what we were able to uncover when we did the cross-sectional evaluations. And then also, this would be more the visible part. How many of those blowouts were still visible externally, which is just typically a smaller number, and then the number of treatments being recorded by the city of Milwaukee as they did this year after year. So, the next slide. We analyzed this with multiple linear regression, one of our go-tos, and Abby helped with this, led the way. We had a full model which included all of those predictors you saw on the last slide. And we did a back and forth stepwise elimination function to get down to a minimal model, the minimally adequate model, which most of them were non-significant, as you'll see. So our models were quite minimal. And we assessed underlying assumptions for these models, making sure that the residuals look good. We didn't have any issues with, unequal variance or non-normality of the residuals, all those things that we look for, and things like multicollinearity, where you have things that are related to each other and throwing your estimates all out of whack. Just typical nerd stat stuff. So next slide. Just some background. We had a range that we were shooting for things like stem diameter. The mean stem diameter for the trees in the study was just over 18 inches or 45 centimeters for folks outside the U.S. The typical tree had 5.6 treatments, meaning that there was a good portion of them that had 5. There's also some that had 6 in the study. Our boulevard width was on average 2.3 meters. So like going about 7 feet, getting down as low as 4 feet in some tight spots. Canopy thinning went from 0%, so these things showed no outward signs of loss of health, to nearly half the canopy thinning. But the mean for our population, our sample size, was just under 13%. Cambial separation, this is the in the bottom 30 centimeters. These are the ones that are both visible or only visible when you do the dissection. We had 5.7 cambial separations on average, so hovering between that 5 and 6. But some had 0. Sometimes there were trees that had absolutely no separation, meaning that the treatment went according to plan, and some poor trees had as many as 25, right? Total discoloration ranged from 11% to 65% discolored, with the mean at 33%, a third of the trunk being discolored. And then there was discoloration in the trunk that was throughout the trunk. And then there was what we attributed to the actual injections. Those were those spokes, much lower, ranging from 2 to 23%, and hovering around the 11% mark for our mean. And the injection sites, it was even lower. Next slide. This is kind of what it looks like as we progress upward through the trunk. Right at the soil line, you're seeing a lot of treatment discoloration and treatment-induced discoloration, the spokes. That continued for the first 3 sections. So those are the ones we focused most of our analysis on. And as you get higher up in the trunk, you have just some background level discoloration that was throughout the tree from other past events. So, next slide. And when we put that into a graphic, Abby came up with this. This is a really clever graphic where we have the distribution of our percentages of discoloration. These are box plots. So the box itself represents the middle 50% of the data set. The vertical black line in the box is the median, which is kind of the middle point. And then the black circle is the mean or the average, right? So if you look at total discoloration, even though we saw that there was more treatment induced and injection related discoloration in the lower third. It didn't translate to any kind of major, bump up in discoloration percentages for the bottom three sections where we saw all that. On average, it was kind of static throughout the entire trunk section. When we do look at just the discoloration associated with injections, those spokes, or the discoloration of the injection sites, the actual like where the drilling occurred, there is more separation. We see that the means switch over, but look at the scales on these graphs. They're not the same, right? So the injection sites, you're looking at a max of like 7% for a median, right? Whereas when you're looking at the means and the medians for the spokes, the middle graph, we're looking at like 15%. So while there is, within those like groups where we did kind of certain different types of discoloration, there is differentiation. On a whole, it was pretty static throughout the trunk. Next slide. So again, we were trying to see if we could look at any of these external signs, and there's a little bit of internal in here as well, those cambial separations, that third point down, to see if any of those predicted, internal discoloration. So we're looking for canopy thinning, planting strip width, cambial separations, number of wounds, and number of treatments. And I'll kind of go through first and show you what wasn't significant, and we'll show you the one thing that was significant, and kind of explain why that is. So, next slide. So, total discoloration, again, this is, if you look at the picture on the right, this is everything grouped together. This is all three of our types of discoloration that we've been talking about through this presentation. When we looked at canopy thinning, planting strip width, the number of canopy separations, I don't know if both the ones that are visible from the surface of the trunk or those included, and then the number of treatments, that the historic record of how many times this thing was treated, none of those predicted total discoloration. Next. Moving on to the things that were a little bit more variable in the bottom three sections of the trunk. The injection-induced discoloration, those spokes. Again, none of those four predictors, canopy thinning, planting strip width, cambial separations, or number of treatments, predicted any of the variability we saw in those discoloration areas. Next. And then finally, rounding out this sea of non-significance is the I make a career off of non-significance, I swear. Is canopy thinning. This is just the wounds of the actual injection sites. None of these things predicted it. So one more slide, Rich. So what did predict? And it wasn't a strong predictor. I think the R-squareds were under 2.2, which is like predicting 20% of what we saw, right? We saw wound count, that external kind of blowout that you saw. There were two cases where it actually predicted total discoloration percent. Discoloration percentage. And so wound count predicted total discoloration, and it predicted injection-induced discoloration, those spokes. It did not predict injection discoloration, just the points where the injections occurred, right? So, and the fun thing is, where you had more wounds, you had less of a percentage of discoloration. So it was counterintuitive. Our working theory for this is that it's just wound wood response, right? So as you have wound wood grow on the around that external wound, it kind of grows outward. It increases the surface area of that cutout, and ash is such a good compartmentalizer that wall force stays intact, and we have clear wood beyond that wound. So we'll show you a little picture of that. Rich, want to show the next slide? So this is some work from the 1950s where increment bores were drilled into a variety of species going from Eastern Cottonwood, which is a really poor compartmentalizer, and Sugarberry, which is also a poor compartmentalizer, to green ash. If you look at green ash, increment bores are a pretty big wound. This thing has really good compartmentalization, and you also see how wall 4 is intact from, the point of where that um, tree was cored on, and it expands a little bit, right? Kind of increasing the area at the point of that measurement. So we think that is partly is at least a partial explanation of why we would see a negative relationship between wound count and the proportion of the trunk that is actually discolored. Next slide. So in conclusion, we have 10 minutes for discussion. We didn't see like all this is to say that we didn't see any really discernible negative effects 4 to 6 cycles after injection. So if you're looking for a long-term viable way to protect the ash in your neighborhood, in your community, you can do this, and even with multiple years of injections, the trees can continue to thrive until you're ready to cycle something else in. There was very little injection caused discoloration relative to xylem area. So, there was kind of a static level of discoloration in the center of the tree, but the actual discoloration caused that we could trace to the injections was minimal. And we also found that external indicators are not often reliable predictors of internal discoloration in our study, at least the vast majority of them. The one that stands out is external wounding, and it doesn't behave how we anticipated. So, with that, Rich. Oh, well,
Sure.
yeah, I forgot about this one. You want to go? I'll do this one.
Go for it. You or me?
You can do it.
Okay, I flipped a coin, I win. So just a summary, current versus past. Yeah, Shigo was an early influencer on myself. I imagine Jake and Andrew for that case, of just the science of bringing science into tree biology and arboriculture, et cetera. And some sage advice: make clean holes, shallow narrow, and as few as possible. And certainly our findings kind of support that. Place holes low as possible. Avoid depressions along roots and trunks. So you got this two roots coming together. We got the depression. Don't treat in that area. Treat actually on top of the bridge of that transition zone. The other aspect is multiple wounds go around the tree. Jake and I actually found one case where it must have been a bad day for the employee, or maybe a Friday at 3 p.m. They put all the injections at one location. It's almost like they're doing target practice or playing darts, trying to hit the 20. It was just kind of insane. We didn't use that particular tree in our study. It was one of our random samples. It was just like, no, they didn't follow manufacturer's recommendations. The last couple of sage advices is observe previous wounds. So whatever you do in arboriculture and urban forestry, make observations. Be your own little practitioner scientist to see if things are actually looking well or if actually you're causing more harm than good. And the last thing is treatments can cause damage. And really the only way you're going to determine externally is by cross-sectioning a tree or maybe a longitudinal section to see how discoloration. And you don't have to get 240 grit sandpaper for statistical studies like we're doing. We had to, but you could actually do it with just a chainsaw to see is your treatment causing more damage. Having said that, we'll turn it over to Q&A, and I'll stop sharing these slides here and go back to Bo.
All right, y'all. That was a great presentation, a really good summary, of the studies, and I appreciate how you all kind of bounced back and forth. That was really good to see. We have a number of questions, and y'all help me out here if there's any that jump out at you. And I'll go with this one. It's a little tangential, but somebody asked, Ethan asked, can you explain some of the benefits / negatives of using imidacloprid as a soil injection for a 1 year treatment of ash trees for EAB versus a mectin benzoate as a root injection, flare injection for the 2 to 3 years of protection?
I'll gladly take that. Actually, I'll add into their dinotefrin, and dinotefrin and imidacloprid are lower cost solutions, but you have to do manually versus emamectin. And if you look at survivability and you look at the modeling of that, we found that actually 15 years ago. It doesn't matter what you use from an economic perspective. One costs less money to buy, but you have to spend more money on repeated applications, and you don't get as good of efficiency for survivability with imidacloprid and dinotephrine. So there's really no wrong answer here. You find one that works for you. For small trees, though, dinotephrine, for example, it's a bark spray. You can do so many trees. And so I call it just kind of anyone wins. There's a lot of different approaches, but survivability, economics, they're all good options. Follow manufacturer's recommendations. Back to you, Bo.
Perfect. Thank you. There was a number of questions about, the discussion of discoloration of what are we talking about here? I'm assuming are we talking about non-functioning xylem, progression of decay? What are y'all seeing? What implications are you seeing to the health of the tree and the structure, potential future structure of the tree? Are you seeing any correlations there?
Jake or Andrew, you want to add?
Yeah, well, so discoloration can be a precursor to dysfunctional wood, and we use that as kind of a proxy for that. The discoloration from the injections is chemical induced from the treatment itself. I think I saw a question asking if discoloration wood was decayed or weaker, and at this stage of what was discolored, no, there wasn't. We did a little bit of a preliminary or a subsampling looking to see if there were decay fungi present. There were some decay fungi present. However, the amount of decay was very, very, very minimal. Maybe just a little bit right around the injection site of ones that hadn't closed up for a long time. But by and large, the discoloration was still solid, if that makes sense. So the wound sealed over for the most part very quickly. There were a few that the cambial separations were still open on the more recent injection treatments, but usually within looking back at all those cross sections, usually within probably 3 to 4 years, they were pretty close to being completely sealed over. And once that wound is sealed over, any decay fungi are kind of more or less being deprived of oxygen that they need to continue decaying. And so the compartmentalization and the sealing over process of the wounds pretty much precluded much, if any, decay from really being an issue from what we found. Does that seem reasonable, Rich? Do you have anything to add to that?
Good explanation, Jake.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jake. Another question here from Kenneth says, did you notice any differences between open injection versus closed injection when both are done properly?
We should have talked about that, but Rich, you can explain the system. I'm sorry. I should have mentioned that in my.
Yeah, we didn't actually study an open system in this long term, but from that previous paper from Forests, that's not behind a paywall. You can get easy access to that for free. If you follow manufacturer recommendations, that's the key thing. Is both systems can be are valid, but you got to make sure you're following manufacturer recommendations. And it can be maybe a little tricky, plug after plug after plug to put them in. You just got to be adamant that when you're training people of the importance of that. The other thing though is the Milwaukee system. A question was what system Milwaukee used. It was actually the closed system, Arborjet with plugs. And that's what we studied with our system here. But we also found with that system, yes, there is more maybe cracking where you don't set the plug correctly, but we didn't find an overall implication of long-term problems with discoloration.
I tossed the paper that you're talking about in the chat for everyone.
Oh, thanks.
There's another question about if drill spacing mattered, Rich. Can you talk a little bit about drill spacing? I mean, I'm assuming there's some recommendations there.
Well, I think two things here is one is you could probably argue if you had all the drills in the same location, you're only going to have discoloration in that spot. But it's really a chemistry uptake. And so by having holes evenly distributed around the tree itself, you get better distribution in the canopy. And also the xylem wood itself is where you're going after larvae. But if you're doing like Dutch elm disease treatments, you want application throughout the canopy for just treating at the insect level. So that's really the answer there is around the tree Y for chemical uptake and efficiency to get even distribution or as best you can.
There was a question here about, the long-term treatment implications of EAB. Now, this study went for 3 years, correct? Is there any continuation to see?
This study actually, Milwaukee started treating trees in 2018 or 2009. We actually went 2021, so they're on a 2-year cycle. So these are trees that were treated at least 8 years. some up to 12.
So we're able to see the effectiveness over. Okay,
Yeah,
I think that.
basically think of it like a decade.
Okay. Let's see. I think we have time. Y'all, are there any other questions that jumped out to you that you wanted to address in the last minute or so that y'all saw?
Yeah, the economic stuff, it's behind a paywall. If you want to actually email me, my last name, Hauer at uwsp.edu, I can send you the paper. There's a question on any concerns of embolisms. Possibly we didn't study that. There's a question, can you explain the physiological effects of cambial separation? Well, it's just wounding, and it's really wall floor. You just got greater damage. Question on loss of wood strength properties. We didn't study that, but certainly we did have a fungal assay that we're looking at in some other decay, or excuse me, responses. We didn't talk about that, but hopefully some papers come out on that. Correlations between discoloration and tree health. We actually did have that as a data set, the tree thinning, and also we did do a CTLA tree condition rating. We found actually no correlation in our study between discoloration. I mean, partially probably because discoloration was so low in our study. Is there a good time to treat in the Midwest before leaf out or leaf emerge? Actually, I tried injecting trees before leaves out. You're going to wait all day. You need actually the leaf transpirational pull to get the chemical up in the tree. I suppose you could use a pressurized system, but usually during the leaf on season, when leaves are functioning, avoid dry periods and also avoid times where leaves are actively going through the senescence process in the fall. And I'll turn it back to you, Bo.
That was awesome. You just went through like 5 questions in about 40 seconds. I loved it. Thank you, Rich.
You're welcome.
Y'all, that takes us to the end of our hour. Thank you to our speakers for a wonderful presentation covering this topic. As y'all see, when we answer one question, research oftentimes opens a lot of new questions, and it's why we need to continue to support groups like Tree Fund. So consider supporting Tree Fund in any of the variety of ways that Heath mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation. So with that, I would like to thank Megan for the introduction today, also to Heath, and welcome y'all back when we come back in potentially June, but certainly in July with Dr. Whitney on another entomological presentation. So with that, thank y'all. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and see you at the next Tree Fund webinar. Signing off. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.